I'm Matt Stroll. I'm assistant professor of philosophy in the philosophy department here at the University of Montana. It's an immense pleasure to be able to introduce my dear friend and teacher, Alexander Nehamas, who will be speaking tonight. This is the President's Lecture Series. I'd like to thank President Dennison for his support. This is also the Henry Bugbee Annual Philosophy Lecture. Several members of Bugbee's family are here tonight. I'd like to thank them for all their support. It's particularly appropriate that Alexander Nehamas be the speaker for the Bugbee Lecture, as Alexander writes extensively about the art of living and what it is to live a philosophical life. And anyone who knows of Henry Bugbee knows that he was one of the great exemplars of a philosophical life. And he also thought deeply about the kind of aesthetic beauty that Alexander will be talking about tonight. I want to say a few things about Alexander's intellectual biography that will hopefully help give you some context for what he's going to say tonight. Alexander Nehamas finished his PhD at Princeton in 1971 under the tutelage of Gregory Vlastos, where he wrote a dissertation on Plato. His first few publications were about Plato's theory of metaphysics and philosophy of language. While he was a grad student at Princeton, he TA'd for Walter Kaufmann's Nietzsche course. So if you know anything about Nietzsche, you know who that is. So Alexander was Kaufmann's TA, and that led him to develop a serious research interest in Nietzsche. In 1985, he published the book Nietzsche, Life is Literature, where he developed a comparison between a well-lived human life and a great work of art. And that comparison permeates all of his work. In light of that development in his thought, he began to think seriously about literature, right? Given that he was going to compare human life to literature, he began to think seriously about what it is for a work of literature to be great. And he had a series of works about literary theory and about literary interpretation. In 1990, he took a job at Princeton University, and he was cross-listed in comparative literature and philosophy. So at this point, he had made it all the way from just doing heavy-duty Plato scholarship to being a true humanist. Over the next few years, he further began to develop this comparison that I mentioned between a well-lived life and a great work of art. And in particular, he began thinking about the contribution that philosophy makes to such a life. And he developed the idea of a philosophical life as one where what's important in that life is subject to and somehow constituted by its own scrutiny. That is to say, that where one examines the values that make one's life good. Well, one of the things that he noticed as he worked on this project was that philosophers hardly ever think about types of value other than morality. So morality would be a type of value that is by nature impartial and extends universally to all other people. When we take a moral attitude, it's one that we take universally. And he noticed that there are other types of value, for instance, the value of friendship or the value of artworks that don't seem to be subsumable under the category of morality, but that make an important contribution to a well-lived human life. So he wrote a book about them, as an attempt to really separate beauty and friendship and things like that, to separate them from morality and treat them on their own. And indeed, not only does he separate them, he makes the scandalous admission that immorality can, in fact, be a positive contribution to a human life, that immorality can be good, in a sense. Well, so in that book about beauty, he developed an extensive comparison between the way that we become friends with someone and the way that we find an artwork beautiful. And that then led him to begin to develop a further theory of friendship, expanding that comparison that he's going to talk about tonight. So without further ado, Alexander Nehamas.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for inviting me here. And Matt, thank you very much. I learned a lot about myself in the last few minutes. I'm very grateful to President Dennison and to the Bugby family for doing me this honor, and I just hope I can prove worthy of it, and I'll do my best, but I can't guarantee anything. So let me just get a little water, if I can do it without spilling anything, and then I'll begin. They're small cups. So, I want to begin with asking a question about this painting by the Florentine artist Giacomo Pontormo. It's called Two Gentlemen with a passage from Cicero's on Dialogue on Friendship. That is a page from, that actually reproduces a page of Cicero's Dialogue on Friendship. And to motivate the question that I want to ask about this painting, I'll show you two others. One is an erotic scene. This is Mars and Venus after an afternoon of dallying. And this is Judith beheading Holofernes. Let's go back now. We can tell that this is an erotic scene just by looking. We can tell that this is a murder of some kind or a killing of some kind just by looking. And if you know something about iconography, you'll know that this is Judith and Holofernes and Mars and Venus and so on. But what about this painting, assuming just for the moment that we don't have Cicero's text? Imagine that we have this painting without Cicero's text. How could we see it as a painting that has to do with friendship? And I think, if you think about it, you'll see that the answer is that we couldn't. Nothing that depends on the visual features of this picture, the way that the others depend on the visual features to tell us what they're about, is associated firmly enough with friendship. And the visual signs of sexuality are many, but the range is limited. And so about murder, the same thing. So many ways you can kill someone. Friendship is different. It has no sure signs. In paintings, friends can be of any gender, they can be of any class, they can be men, they can be embracing each other, they can be gossiping, so to speak. Sometimes when I gave this lecture before, I would give those paintings with fake titles. And nobody would be able to tell that they're actually the real title, so to speak, is Two Friends or whatever they are. Friends or enemies can engage in the acts that friends engage in, like kissing, for example. Friendship can be between men and women. This is Titian's self-portrait with two friends, and so on. Friends, in other words, they can have sexual overtones, friendships, and here is a famous painting by Gustave Courbet, which was actually known as Two Friends for a long time. It's now, I think they've given it a rather more descriptive title. Okay. The fact is that in paintings, as I said, friends can be of any age, of gender, class, they can be cool or passionate, they can be doing something together, they can be doing nothing together, they can be looking at each other, looking out, they can be absorbed in their own interests, whatever it is. They can be doing almost anything together. And so they can in real life as well. We can't tell by looking at two people whether they're friends or not, in life or in painting. There is no path, that is, from any particular interaction that two people have to their friendship, if friendship their relationship is. Even dying for me does not necessarily show that you're my friend. And you remember Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities, when Sidney Carton dies in the place of Charles Darnay, but he doesn't do it for Darnay's sake. He does it for the sake of Darnay's wife, Lucy, with whom he is in love, and for their child. And there is another problem, not only that there is no behavior that's firmly associated with friendship, friendship is only manifested over time in a series of interactions. And painting has real trouble with subjects that are temporally extended in that sense. But if that is so, then it is at least striking that friendship is not and has not been a really important subject for the novel. Because the novel focuses on relationships that span long tracts of time, large tracts of time. only a few novels do, I mean, there are friends in every great novel and many bad novels too, but I'm not denying that. But only a few novels do more than include friendships of friends among their characters and take friendship as their subject, in the way that so many novels, say, address love, family, education, adultery, treason, revenge, or famously, war and peace. And part of the reason, I think, is that, as the English essayist William Hazlitt wrote in the 19th century, and I quote him, "In our habitual intercourse with others, we much oftener require to be amused than assisted. We consider less, therefore, what a person with whom we are intimate is ready to do for us in critical emergencies than what he has to say on ordinary occasions." In other words, despite the epic and Achilles and Patroclus and things like that, friendship is not often associated with extreme situations or extreme feelings. Achilles, in fact, his desperate mourning for the death of Patroclus and his bloody, bloody revenge prompted classical Athens a few hundred years later to see them as lovers. And in Montaigne's famous essay on friendship, his description of his feelings for his best friend, Etienne de la Boétie, sounded quite lustful to a number of his readers. Ordinarily, friendship is manifested in what I can only call ordinary situations, which, in fact, in most cases, all but the friends themselves find inconsequential. In fact, there's nothing more boring, frankly, to listen to friends talking to one another. I mean, it's not a spectator sport, so to speak. So, to establish a friendship between its characters, a novel generally, and to try to take that as its subject, a novel would have to include many inconsequential moments of this sort, and only against a background of such inconsequential moments, when the extraordinary event occurs, only against that background could we tell that the characters act out of friendship rather than out of duty or erotic love or recklessness or whatever else you want to think about. Now, we might think, of course, that that's not a peculiar feature of friendship, that the interactions that friends have are generally inconsequential. Little, for example, seems less consequential than what George Eliot calls the unhistoric acts of many of her characters, people who, as she says in Middlemarch, and I quote her, lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs. But there is a real difference. Eliot presents characters who spend themselves, and I quote her again, like that river of which Cyrus, the Persian emperor, broke the strength in channels which had no great name on earth, precisely to endow those apparently significant events with significance in order to trace the growth, so to speak, that springs to life when that river's waters finally find their way into the earth. But the events through which a friendship is manifested, if they are to serve their purpose, must be represented as insignificant. And a narrative of insignificant events is unlikely to absorb its readers. That is driven home by what may be actually one of the two great novels of friendship. That's Gustave Flaubert's Bouvard and Pécuchet, a book in which Flaubert wrote in a letter, he hoped, I quote him, to spit the gall that chokes me. Stupidity now crushes me so hard that I feel like a fly with the Himalayas on its back. I will try to vomit my venom in my book. A misanthrope in some ways. But to lift the weight of stupidity from his shoulders, he transferred it to two friends. Because only friends, in this case, two retired clerks who meet by accident and become very, very good friends of each other, and who, though they are totally incompetent, try serially to master every aspect of human accomplishment. So they try agriculture, they try chemistry, they try medicine, they try history, they try archaeology, literature, aesthetics, politics, love, and much else beside. And they fail every single time. That doesn't bother them. So we failed with chemistry, let's try this. And then they fail again, and they start again. Only friends could tolerate each other, I think, through all those miserable failures. And only such a repetitive series of incidents could display their friendship convincingly. So Flaubert's novel raises two questions for us. First, if friendship enables this kind of sort of farcical behavior that those guys engage in, what is the good of it? What's so good about friendship? And second, is it possible to represent friendship both interestingly and convincingly? Flaubert was, interestingly enough, very worried about that question. He worried that his book would put readers to sleep from the start, as he put it, since, again I quote him, it presents the same situation over and over and might bore them to death. And it does. Although the book has been hailed as a modernist masterpiece or a postmodernist masterpiece before its time, although its most recent translator writes that boring it's not once we've accepted the ground rules, I assure you it's not a joy to read. I mean, you start out saying, this time I'm going to go through it, and you read through the first failure and the second failure and the third failure, and after a while I couldn't care less about what's going on. To claim, as this man does, that its repetitiveness is a huge part of its comic effect is only special pleading. And to compare it, as he does, to the Three Stooges' head bonks and nose tweaks, or Laurel and Hardy's fine messes, the more we expect them, the funnier they become. Seems to me to concede what I will argue in just a little while, that drama is much better suited for representing friendship than narrative. A novel that consists of a long series of insignificant occasions is bound to be, to that extent, a boring novel. So, what do we know so far? I've tried to suggest that friendship, first, is associated with no particular kind of behavior, that most of the actions that it's generally associated with are insignificant, humdrum, everyday events. And again, the question is, what is so good about it? Why does Cicero, the great Roman orator, author of De Amicitia, why does he insist that if friends, affection, and goodwill are removed from life, all the joy is gone out of it? Why does Ralph Waldo Emerson see in it, quote again, that select and sacred relation which even leaves the language of love suspicious and common? So much is this purer, and nothing is so much divine. Why do our philosophers praise it so much? On what grounds? Very interesting, philosophy on that issue is more or less of one mind, and that's a very unusual occurrence, actually. Some did have their doubts. St. Augustine has doubts about friendship. La Rochefoucauld has doubts about it, but he has doubts about everything that has any value. Immanuel Kant, Schopenhauer, and Søren Kierkegaard all had their doubts about friendship. But on the whole, the philosophical tradition is overwhelmingly on the side of Aristotle, who thought that friendship is, as he put it, either a virtue or follows upon it, and is absolutely necessary for life. No one, he continues, would choose to live without friends, even if he had every other good. So on the one hand, he said it's like virtue, or maybe a virtue, and on the other, he distinguished three kinds of what we say friendships, we call friendships. He distinguished between people who are friends because they profit from their relationship with one another, people who care for the pleasure they derive from the relationship, and finally, what he calls genuine friends, people who are attracted to each other's virtue. This third kind is the most perfect kind, but Aristotle knows that very, very few people are virtuous. So, real friendship, he says, is very, very rare and an unalloyed good. Now, friendship is not rare, is it? I mean, it's everywhere. We see it everywhere. And yet, not only does Aristotle think it's rare, but the philosophical tradition, to an extent really unparalleled in a field that sometimes considers agreement a form of discourtesy, as philosophers often do, the tradition has concurred with Aristotle. Cicero, Seneca, St. Eldred, St. Thomas, Montaigne, Francis Bacon, and many others, including most recent authors on the subject, repeat the threefold classification of Aristotle. They limit true friendship to the morally virtuous. So only virtuous people can be friends, and friendship makes them even more virtuous than they are. And finally, they considered it an unmixed blessing. Without it, even paradise is robbed of pleasure. With me, Milton's Adam laments, I see not who partakes. In solitude, what happiness? Who can enjoy alone, or all enjoying, what contentment find? So, the question is, are all good friends morally virtuous people, or could a good friend be a bad person? The Aristotelian tradition thinks not. Aristotle, however, did not give us any examples of the virtuous. Cicero decided he was going to fill the gap. He said, I'm not going to be like those philosophers who make virtue so rare that nobody really can have it. I'm going to bring it down to earth. So we're only going to think about people, I quote him, who have been models of honor, integrity, justice, and generosity, without avarice, lustfulness, or insolence, and with unwavering conviction. Well, I mean, that may be more down to earth, but it leaves most of the people I know, including myself, without friends. My colleague at Princeton, John Cooper, who is more realistic than Cicero, has argued that neither in fact nor in Aristotle do friends have to be what he calls moral heroes. Genuine friendship, he says, requires only, I quote him, the binding force within it of some, perhaps for all that partial and incomplete excellence of the character. It binds people who love one another because of their good human qualities. But although this does acknowledge human imperfection, it leaves the connection between friendship and moral virtue intact. He concludes, one chooses a friend for his proved virtue. In other words, you see somebody who's virtuous and you become their friend because you admire that feature of theirs. Yet the hero of Flaubert's novel Sentimental Education, the second greatest novel of friendship, Frederick Moreau is his name, befriends his lifelong friend Charles Delaurier because when they're in school, Delaurier beats a servant almost to death because the servant called him a pauper's brat. Now, Frederick finds that very honorable and brave in his friend, but Flaubert gives us no reason to believe that that's right. He thinks, on the contrary, that it's an indication of Delaurier's impetuous character, typical of his hot temper. So Frederick's love springs not from a recognition of excellence or virtue, but from a mistaken interpretation. And yet, although excellence is not what binds these two people, it is hard to deny that their friendship is genuine. In the novel's closing scene, quote, reconciled once again, they've had a number of fights, by that irresistible element in their nature which always reunited them in friendship, they reminisce about a long ago visit to a brothel when they were young. They stole during a Sunday when everybody else was in church. They stole flowers from Frederick's mother's garden. They went a long way around so that nobody would see them. They got to the brothel, but then Frederick froze, speechless and motionless. He was too embarrassed to do anything. And so finally they ran off while the prostitutes were laughing at them, and they forgot to go the roundabout way. They were caught, and there was huge scandal. And here are the very closing lines of the novel. They told one another the story at great length, each supplementing the other's recollections. And when they had finished, that was the best time we ever had, said Frederick. Yes, perhaps you're right. That was the best time we ever had, said Delaurier. Virtue? No, only two trivial characters reveling in the banality that sustained their close and intimate, genuine friendship. Now, friendship is not, however, despite everything that I said, the central theme of this novel. The true place of friendship is in drama. Theater, film, and especially, as far as I'm concerned, I won't talk about it tonight, television. For example, in Thelma and Louise, Ridley Scott's 1991 film, friendship is manifested between these two women, played by Gina Davis and Susan Sarandon, is manifested in action that are neither trivial nor morally neutral, but positively terrible. Thelma, the younger one, Gina Davis, who is pathologically flighty, disorganized, insecure, or whatever, and Louise, older and a woman who treats her more or less like a child, go off on a two-day vacation. On the way, Thelma starts flirting with a guy at some bar. He almost rapes her. Louise stops the assault, and then quite gratuitously, when the man says something nasty to her, just turns around and shoots him dead. They then try to flee to Mexico, but Thelma is constantly getting them into trouble because she's very foolish. They pick up a young guy from the road. It's Brad Pitt in his breakout role, actually. He turns out to be a robber, and he explains how he robs stores to Thelma, who nevertheless leaves all the money in the room and goes out. And of course, he takes their money and goes. And at that point, Louise, the older and more serious one, just loses it. She can't deal with it anymore. But at that point, Thelma, who has been gradually coming to her own, finds faith in herself, finds self-esteem and self-respect, and becomes capable of doing things of her own. So what does she do? Well, she robs a store, just like the young robber has told her how to do it. She goes in, says, "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, this is a robbery. Please, nobody will be hurt." And she's very polite, she gets money, and they go. Later on, when a policeman tries to arrest them, she locks him up in his trunk and blows 2 holes in the trunk to breathe, you know. And eventually the two of them blow up a huge gasoline truck because the driver had been bothering them on the road. Eventually, at the rim of Grand Canyon, there's a huge manhunt. Of course, they arrive at the rim of the Grand Canyon with a huge number of police cars blocking their getaway. They can't get away anymore. They finally look at one another and they decide they don't want to live the way they have lived so far. So they start the car and they drive the car off the rim of the Grand Canyon. And the movie ends with a car frozen in midair to the tune of B.B. King's Better Not Look Down. Now, these are not just friends who do bad things, as friends often do. There's a friendship through which both women become more admirable because they do bad things. The friendship gradually becomes a friendship of equals and gives them a way out of the dead ends to which their lives were to lead them, and leads them to choose a short but glorious life over a long and shabby one. Now, choosing a short and glorious life over a long and shabby one is precisely the commonplace that we say about Achilles in Homer's Iliad. That's what he chooses. He chooses to die rather than live without glory. That may seem ridiculous to you, but I ask, why is desecrating an opponent's dead body, as Achilles does, over the death of a warrior, Patroclus, who of course dies in war, as warriors do, why is that so much better than the murder of a malicious would-be rapist and the relatively minor crimes to which it leads? But before turning to that question, I would like to suggest very tentatively why drama, I think, is suited to the representation of friendship. And to do so, I need to make yet another detour to a particular episode that I will refer to again. A very good friend of mine visiting me, let's call him Tom because that's his name. He visited some years ago on a very cold and rainy morning when I was driving my son to school. He was 10 years old, my son at the time, so Tom wanted to come with me to keep me company, but he was still in his pajamas. And my son said, "Look, it's too embarrassing, put something on." So he put a raincoat on, no shoes, just barefoot. So he runs, okay, says, "I'm not going to get out of the car, who will see me?" Okay, so we went to the school. But when we arrived, I realized that I had a flat tire and no notion of how to replace it. Very heavy traffic. There was a very narrow driveway where people went and left their children off. My car is right there, stopped. It's very difficult for other cars to come by. Nobody knows what to do, and all of a sudden, Tom leaps out of the car in his pajamas and raincoat and bare feet. It's raining, and he starts fixing the car. Every few seconds or few minutes, he has to stop and go by so that the next car can pass and go off. Completely sort of impervious to what was happening. Of course, the children stared incomprehensibly at what was going on. Some of the adults offered to help. Others just watched or made jokes. A colleague, for example, told me, "I love your friend's outfit." But he was totally oblivious. He fixed the tire. He drove us to a gas station. We're still in pajamas. He discussed with the owner what we needed to do about the tire. And he returned home. Immediately went to work while I collapsed in a useless heap. So, if you ask me, why is this man, Tom, your friend? Among other things, I will cite this episode, as I did just now. And maybe I would say, look, he acted kindly and generously with a very strong practical sense, but that would really miss the point, wouldn't it? Which is that he did what he did in that ridiculous outfit without a second thought, that this very practical sense of his exists along with a touchy touching otherworldliness, that it was completely in character, and so on. No one else could have done just what he did. What mattered, in other words, was not in fact just what he did, but, I say unhelpfully at this point, who he is. And that's not something that any list of his features can ever spell out. The list is always going to be unsatisfactory and incomplete. Think how banal we sound when we try to explain to someone why we love them, and how disappointed we feel once we run out of positive features: kind, generous, intelligent, imaginative, open, sensitive, loyal, and another 40 or so adjectives. There are plenty of kind people in the world, but that's no reason to love all of them. Why then is it a reason for loving this particular person? Why is it that I can say I love him because he's kind, and I don't say, but I love her because she too is kind, and I don't love her at all? One way we try to explain that by saying it's not kindness in general, it's this particular kindness, my friend's particular kindness, that only he can express. Yeah, sure, but explaining how his particular kindness differs from another person's kindness is exactly as difficult as giving a full list of my reasons for loving him. We don't really add anything by putting that little term particular in there. And so we often say that we love our friends not for this, that, or any other feature of theirs, but, as we put it, for themselves. And so we wrap our original mystery in the enigma of this self that seems to stand behind, over and above, or separately from the totality of its features. So it's not because he's kind, it's not because he's generous, it's not because he's this, that, or the other. I love him for himself. So who is this man, Tom, who's not the same thing as kind, so on and so forth? We don't know. We leave that completely unexplained. And yet there is something to this way of speaking. Some people with whom I interact satisfy desires I already have. And generally, I know what it is that I expect from them. My interest in them, apart from some minimum respect that we owe, I believe, everyone, is limited to those features of theirs that enable them to serve my purposes. And although I know that there is more to them than that, I don't for that reason feel the need to come to know what that is any better. The waiter at the restaurant is there to serve food and to answer my questions and so on. I'm not going to ask or to care about, whom they're in love with, or how much money they make, or whether they're happy. They're mainly, in other words, means to my ends. But some other people I treat not merely as means to my ends, but also as ends in themselves. That is, I take not only what I want seriously, but I take what they want as seriously as I take my own desires, and I'm ready to come to want new things, and so to change myself because of them. These are the people I love. Now, aware that my knowledge of my friends is only partial, I expect that what I don't yet know about them will be as attractive as what I already do know. And with that expectation, I want to come to know them better. In other words, friendship, like every kind of love, is a commitment to the future. When we say that we love someone or that we find something beautiful, we're not just describing features that this object has. We are describing features like that, but we're also saying, if that thing becomes part of my life will in some way or another be better. And I can't say now how, but I hope, I suspect, I guess that they will make my life better in some way or other. My reasons for loving you include what I expect to find as I come to know you better. And that commitment to the future, I think, is what every explanation of why I love somebody necessarily leaves out. That promise of a better future, which depends specifically on my friend. For how could I express what I already know I don't know? I can't say what that is, except that I hope it's there. But what I know I don't know is exactly what underlies our talk of loving our friends for themselves, or I love you for yourself. When we say that, we're saying, I love you for what you are and for what you will prove yourself to be in the future. And there's both an element of danger and an element of excitement in that kind of risk or prediction that we make about the future. Where others, in other words, saw an amusing eccentric or a bother, both of them right, in Tom's action, I saw in it an expression of much that I knew of him already, and in addition, the realization of that promise that our friendship had issued to me. A promise that only he, with his history, could make, and only I, with my own history, could see. A product, in fact, of our history together, which no one else can share. In his action, as I would like to put it, I saw Tom himself. In other words, that action expressed to me who Tom is, and in understanding it, I took everything I knew about him into account, including his decisiveness, his gestures and tone of voice, his way with practical things, and a myriad other details that were to me visible in his behavior. But nothing I could say about them could enable another person to see what I saw in the action, because what I saw depended, as I said, on our history together, and that's not something that others can share. Friendship, like the self that is expressed in it, is always embodied, in other words, and its depictions require embodiment as well, including the looks, the gestures, the bodily dispositions that are essential to textured communication. Since these are irreducibly visual, that makes friendship a very difficult subject for narrative, but since they're also inherently temporal, they take time to manifest themselves and form no particular family, as I was saying before, that makes it a bad subject for painting. What friendship consists of is actions, and actions, as Aristotle taught us in the Poetics many, many years ago, is the stuff of drama. Now, the problems faced by representing friendship, I think, say something about friendship itself, which is why I have stayed so long with them here. They show, if I can summarize a bit, that friendship is expressed in every kind of action, in trivial and commonplace events, in crimes. It takes time to manifest itself, and it may often affect us before we're even aware that we have become someone's friend. It's not that I'd say, oh yeah, we'll be friends. It's just that I enjoy somebody's company, and one day I realize that we are friends. But there's not a moment when I sort of decide that this is going to be a friendship. It is also, and I think that's very important, inherently dangerous, because we don't know what this promise that I talked about is likely to bring. I may one day judge, perhaps too late again, that our relationship has done me harm. Or worse, that my judgment worse, it may be that my judgments and standards have suffered as well. And so I may find myself one day happy in situations I would have thought intolerable before I met you. And so I ask again, if friendship does or doesn't do all that, what is the good of it? So let me try to give you a sense of the answer, a sense not because I don't think you're capable of understanding it, because that's all I know. A very unlikely place, a very famous passage in Nietzsche's book on the genealogy of morality. He writes, just as the popular mind separates the lightning from its flash and takes the latter for an action, for an operation of a subject called lightning, say lightning flashes, so popular morality also separates strength from expressions of strength as if they were a neutral substratum behind the strong man, which was free to express strength or not to do so. But there is no such substratum. There is no being behind doing, effecting, becoming. The doer is merely a fiction added to the deed. The deed is everything. Now, that's not obvious what he could be saying here, but let me tell you something even less obvious that he says. He makes this claim during a long passage where he is trying to establish the origins of Christianity. And for him, Christianity is a revolt of the weak, as he calls them, of the Roman Empire against the strong Roman oppressors. And Nietzsche, basically he says that Christianity was an invention of the Jews to take revenge on the Romans and to allow themselves to survive, to resist assimilation to the Roman Empire. His view is the Jews realized that if they didn't do something, they would lose their identity, the Romans would assimilate them. They knew they couldn't beat them in war, so they decided, or they developed this morality that said it's bad to be strong and military and beat people up. It's good to be meek and turn the other cheek and all that sort of thing. And in that case, in that way, they conquered the Romans. And as he says, look who is sitting on the throne of Rome. Or as I ask my students, how many Romans do you know? You know, there are not that many left, any. But his view is that at that point, this what he calls a slave revolt in morality, invented the self or the soul as a separate entity within us in order to attribute our manner of life to a free choice. There's a soul or the subject or the self, it's the substratum, whatever you want to call it, standing, so to speak, separate from all its actions and deciding, should I go this way or should I go that way? Should I be strong or should I be weak? For Nietzsche, you don't have a choice about whether you're strong or weak, but you can convince yourself that you have. And when, as you have to, you act weakly, you say, oh, that was my choice, so I'm very virtuous. Or when you act strongly, you say, oh my God, that was my choice, I'm a sinner. That's how he sees it. In that way, he says, the weak could think that strength is a vice, something the strong need not have exercised, while at the same time elevating weakness, I quote him, that is to say their essence, their effects, their whole ineluctable, irremovable reality into a voluntary achievement, willed, chosen, a deed, a meritorious act. Now, Nietzsche says there's no being behind doing, the deed is everything. He does not reject the idea that, you know, there are persons who act, though I think many people, myself included earlier on, interpret him to say that way, to speak that way because we couldn't think of anything else. What he says, if you read him carefully, is that there is no subject behind or separate from its deed, a neutral agent who's free to act this way or that. In other words, his view is that the agent, myself, I, am not something over and above everything that I do. I am in what I do. My actions express precisely who I am, not who I freely chose to be among various different possibilities. But this view, which I think is much more reasonable, still conflicts with the general way we have of understanding human action, which is to think of them as a special group of events in the world, of occurrences in the world, namely events which we cause by our mental powers, by our desires, by our intentions, by our attitudes. On a physical level, this is a very commonplace example in philosophy, and recently in neurophysiology as well. Raising my arm and having my arm raised by an electrode in my brain, there's no difference between the two on the physical level. The only difference is that when I raise my arm, I intend to do so, whereas when you put an electrode in my brain, I don't intend to do so. The same motion that would have occurred otherwise occurs. Now, Nietzsche's view, by contrast, denies that my intentions are distinct mental entities that precede the actions that I perform. So it's not as if we say, in every case where we act intentionally, say, well, I intend to say what I'm going to say now. If I were going to intend to say what I'm telling you now, I would never start. Because if I to formulate the intention, right, I would have to formulate an intention to formulate the intention, and to formulate that intention, I would have to formulate yet another intention. I'd never start speaking. I don't intend to tell you what I'm saying now, and yet I say what I say intentionally. It's not an accident that I'm speaking that way, at least I hope not. So, if I intend to tell you, for example, that I like you, I say to myself, I'm going to tell this woman how much I like her. In fact, what comes out is this very ambiguous, ambivalent statement, saying, well, yeah, you're okay, but you know, you have this problem and that problem. This causal view that I'm criticizing would interpret this fact by saying that my action, my saying, you're so-and-so and such, is a failed effort to say why I like you. I would still be the person who likes you, but I would have to find a better way to express myself. But if the intention, as I'm suggesting, is in the action, it's not that I failed to express myself, it's that I did express myself. I turn out to be the person who doesn't like you all that much. And the only question now for me is what do I want to do about it? Right. So you see the difference between the two ways of construing action. If that's right, then, in fact, very often, in fact, I think that's true with most everything we actually do, we never know exactly what it is that we're doing until we've done it. And the character of what we're doing, especially when an action is complicated and takes time, can change while it's being performed. Our actions, most of which, of course, are much more complicated than the stock philosophical examples of moving your finger or raising your arm, with which philosophers and neurophysiologists now are trying to understand freedom of the will. I mean, think how many times have you just moved your finger? It's not an action that we perform very often, and yet that's supposed to be the paradigm human action by which people try to understand the will. So most of our actions are much more complicated than that. They begin with a very hazy idea of their purpose and character. Think, for example, how often you have to say something in order to find out what you believe. Or something I'm sure most of you have experienced, when you realize which movie you want to see only after your friend tells you what they want to see. Of course, you start out by saying, oh, I don't care which movie we go. We can go to any movie. And your friend says, let's go to this movie. You say, oh, no, that's not what I want. But it's only then that you realize what you actually wanted. To say, in other words, or say other actions, more complex actions than that, it's more, even clearer. Writing a poem. You start out, oh, I'll write a poem about the spring. Well, okay. So you write the first sentence of that poem, and then that first sentence leads you to say something else. In the process, you find out that you have to change the first sentence and then come back again, change it yet again. And every time you make a new step, you open up new possibilities, you close off different ones, and very often you come back and change what you've already done. Or, for that matter, an action as complex as my preparing this lecture. I mean, I could say that what I was planning to do in this lecture was to show that friendship is a good. But that's to say I began with this very general, very vague idea, an idea which I hope I can manage to refine a bit while working on it, my intention gradually becoming inseparable from the lecture I produced. If the lecture is any good, I can't tell you what I intended apart from giving you the lecture itself. I can't say, well, I intended to tell you that friendship is a good. Well, yeah, that's just a very vague description of what I did. I hope, anyway. So, as I said before, every step in the direction of finishing the lecture also makes me change the direction in which I was going and change what I've already done and move in yet a different direction in ways I could not possibly anticipate beforehand. So whatever my lecture turns out to be, it will reveal the kind of agent or the kind of philosopher I am. It won't be, oh, well, I failed to express my deep philosophical views. I really had such better things to tell you tonight, but I didn't have time to prepare. Or Matt took me to the movies yesterday and I'm muddle-headed today, whatever. You know, my ideas emerge as I formulate them, and my actions acquire the very character as I perform them. It is through doing those things that I become who I am. And so, sadly perhaps, who I am is constituted not by unrealized possibilities or by unfulfilled plans, but only by the possibilities I realize and by the plans I fulfill. I'm in those plans and those acts and not behind them. What I accomplish is, in the long run, the best I can do. The bite of conscience, the sense of guilt, is not, I think, a regret that I chose to do the wrong thing. I say, oh my God, why did I do that? And very often we interpret that as the idea that I should have done the contrary. I want to say it's not that at all. It's rather, when I say to myself, oh, I shouldn't have done that, what I'm expressing is the very painful realization that in acting as I did, I showed myself to be inferior to what I had supposed or hoped I was. On this conception, an action succeeds not because it fulfills some earlier intention, which it satisfies perfectly, but because I can see myself in it. By which I mean I see the self I want to be in it. And to see myself, I need to take account not just of that particular action, but also of other actions, of my character in general, my history, and even, to some extent, my place within a whole social tradition. And since, as I suggested before, I have no privileged access to my intentions, I don't always know what they are, I don't know which movie I intend to go to until you tell me that you want to go to the other one, my action can be successful only if others can also, at that time or later, see it in the appropriate terms. So as somebody who wrote about this topic has said, I haven't performed the action, haven't volunteered for the mission, say, if nothing I do is understood by others as such an act. In other words, if you're there and the lieutenant says, who will volunteer for this, and you sort of blink, and you say, well, I meant I volunteer. No, you didn't. You didn't just fail to volunteer, you didn't do it at all, if it's impossible for others to understand. So, if our intentions are not the causes of our actions, as I'm saying, what are they? I suggest that ultimately they're nothing other than the very actions themselves, fully specified. Not an independent object that our actions mean, but what the actions fully and exactly are. But how we specify our action is always provisional. It's relative to the information we already have and the extent of our interest in it. And both those things can change. The interpretation, and therefore the nature of what we do, can always be contested. And there are no neutral criteria for getting it right. If there were, we in the humanities would have no work. Some actions, of course, may not be worth contesting. Others may be unsuited for self-expression. If I want to say that an action is mine if I express myself in it, you may well wonder how I express myself as I'm walking down the corridor in my office and I say a casual hello to someone. In what sense does that express me? Well, I want to say, yes, it does express me. It expresses me to the extent that I'm a social being who engages in at least rudimentary social behavior with other people. Not everything that expresses me needs to be unique to myself. Many of the things that I express are features that join me to the rest of the world. Not everything about us is, of course, unique. Nevertheless, despite the fact that not everything about us is different from the rest of the world, we take our differences, I believe, very seriously indeed. Now, of course, from one point of view, everybody is different, right? Since our personal histories, in their particularity, are, as we say, unique to us. But since that is necessary to everyone's life, differences are not on their own grounds of pride and joy, despite the best efforts of early American education to convince us that they are. Oh, all your children are unique, and we're so proud to have them today in our school. I mean, how many times has one heard that? Many, too many. The differences that count are those that literally make a difference. The differences that distinguish us from others in interesting, admirable, or for that matter, even contemptible ways. And in this case, in this context, friends, close friends in particular, are very important. They make a difference that counts. Perhaps Aristotle was right when he said that to live alone, one has to be either a god or a beast. And Nietzsche added the combination, a philosopher. To see that Aristotle had a point, we must reject not only his restriction of friendship to men, which philosophers have now finally been able to get over, but also his restriction of it to adults, which, unlike sociologists or social psychologists, we have not yet been able to do. We can learn a lot from the friendships of children. For instance, it is crucial that children, adolescents, and those people we unfortunately call young adults find it very easy to make new friends, and that making new friends becomes progressively more difficult. In fact, it turns out that about age 40 is the cutoff point. It becomes much more difficult after about the age of 40. And we usually say, well, that's because by then we have professional obligations, family obligations, not too much time, we have too many other things in mind. That's not the whole story by any means. The great writer C.S. Lewis once insisted that friendship is, I quote, almost wholly free of jealousy. Now, to say that, I think he must have been thinking only of the most idealized adult relationships. And for that reason, he must have left the extraordinarily intense jealousies of children and teenagers totally out of account. But why should being deserted by a friend provoke the sharp pangs of jealousy or the dull pain of rejection? Not simply, I think, because in losing a friend we've lost a playmate or a schoolyard ally or a theater companion or a tennis partner, nor because of the loss of a secret sharer or someone in whom, as in a mental mirror, we can see something of ourselves that we can't see on our own. At the core of such, to quote Coleridge, grief without a pang, void, dark, and drear, lurks the anguish of a deeper, more pervasive abandonment, a rejection not merely of what we have done, but of what we are. We don't just love our friends for themselves, we also leave them for themselves. We don't so much leave them for what they've done, we leave them for what we realize they are. Which is why, of course, the question, what have I done wrong, is always the wrong question to ask when somebody abandons us. And that is partly because, as Lewis in this instance was correct to observe, friendship must exclude. If I say, these are my friends, I imply those are not. Our friendships make us different from the others, and our differences are essential to our own self-understanding. Through them, we establish who we are, and we develop features and capacities that only our relationship with friends can generate. So when a friend abandons me, she rejects not only who I am, as I was just saying, she also rejects what both of us became through our relationship. She is rejecting my part in what she is, which is also why the answer or the statement, it's not you, it's me, is no consolation at all. So I return now once again, and sort of in the last parts of this paper, to the idea that most of what friends do together is commonplace and unimportant. That is not exactly wrong. It's like saying that for most of the people in that schoolyard that morning, Tom's behavior was just eccentric, which is also not exactly wrong, whereas to me it was an expression of generosity, independence, practicality, and willingness to help that only he could have done. In seeing it thus, I did not only confirm what I already knew about him, because I already knew he was generous, but I learned another way in which he was generous, something that I couldn't have predicted about him, but which I find extraordinarily satisfying and admirable once I am exposed to it. That's part of the promise that I was talking about before. That's something I could not have known beforehand, no matter how well I knew my friend. What others, in other words, may perceive as an isolated action, friends understand in terms of everything they know about each other. And to the extent that what we know about each other is always provisional, what our friend did remains unclear. But as the action unfolds and gets connected to still other actions, it gets reinterpreted in their light, and that new understanding, in the same way that I was describing before, can lead to new directions, revealing ways of continuing that only become possible now, and once follow, again affect the action and the interpretation of its purpose, and so on, without an end that is externally imposed. What I am doing, what my action expresses, and who I am, all come into existence together. But since others also have a hand in understanding my action, they can affect both what I do and how I understand it. And so, of course, what I'm likely to become. Which is, of course, why we're told that we should choose our friends with caution. My friends are not the only people who can do that, but the large body of knowledge they bring to their interpretations implicates more aspects of myself and affects me more radically. What I become, therefore, is very much their doing. And the less settled I am in myself, the greater the contribution and the more pervasive their influence. Since we are considerably more changeable in youth than we eventually become as we age, friendship comes easily while we are still young. This is by far, I think, the single most important reason why making friends becomes more difficult with age. A new friendship always brings with it the prospect of serious change. And the more settled we are in ourselves, the less we are willing or able to confront a change of that nature. Friends have a privileged role in this lifelong process of self-construction, not because they're good people, not because they are wise, not because they are generous, but because we love them. We love them, as we say, for themselves, not just for what we know about them, but also for what we hope they will become and how they will then affect us. We expect from them help with our current needs, our desires and plans, but more important, we give them the power to lead us to need and to desire new things, things that perhaps at this point we can't even imagine. And the sense that there is more to our friends than we have seen so far is a constant incitement to come to know them better. Knowledge in this context is not passive. It changes both the knower and the known, and the further we look and reinterpret, the more extensively we are likely to change. In a very good novel, actually, about friendship, a novel called White City Blue, Frankie Blue, the hero of the novel, says, life is a habit. You do something, then you do it again, and before you know it, that's what you are, and that's who you are, and you can't imagine being anything or anyone else. But Frankie, who says that at the very beginning of the book, doesn't know that he will soon fall in love and reaffirm a very old friendship of his, which will lead him to acknowledge a painful truth in his past and a joyful one in his present, making it possible for him to imagine that he might not remain, as he has always been so far, forever Frank the Fib. He's a real estate agent and he lies constantly. But gradually, through the friendship and through the love, he changes, and he narrates the book, and he tells us, I've changed. And then you turn the page and there's another chapter that says, or perhaps not. Friendship, in other words, is what I would like to call a mechanism of individuality. Art, more generally, everything that we find beautiful is another. Both or all spark the need to come to know things as intimately as possible in their particularity, to understand just how they're different from every other thing in the world. They pull in a direction contrary to the direction of morality, which enjoins us to extend fair and impartial treatment of others as far as we possibly can. Not just to believe that it's right to do so, or for that matter, to intend to do so, but actually to do it. That, I believe, requires reciprocity on the part of those we treat in that manner, and that in turn requires significant changes on both our parts. We can't assume that people mistreating one another only because of ignorance or irrationality, and that they can always, at least in principle, be convinced to change their ways by rational argument. As the philosopher Bernard Williams once asked, what will the professor's justifications do when they break down the door, smash his spectacles, take him away? Many significant moral and social changes occur not because the proponents convince the world with their arguments, but because more women, say, entering the workplace, more homosexuals living openly. As such, the others get used to their presence and gradually change, become able to treat them with trust and respect. These changes establish common psychological, institutional, and cultural grounds between us. They make us, to that extent, more similar to one another, and on that, their value depends. But the values of morality, values that promote our commonalities, are not the only values there are. Despite the moralistic or pan-moralistic attitude that permeates both academic thought and the broader public, and confuses even professional courtesy and etiquette, even good manners, with ethics, there are also the values of love. I'm almost tempted to call them aesthetic. Values that pull us towards establishing our differences, or establishing differences from one another, and set us on a singular path through the world. A path that may sometimes conflict with morality, with, once again, no neutral criteria to decide which to give up when the conflict faces us. To the extent, then, that I can see an object in its particularity, I see something that is nowhere else in the world. Something that can only be expressed in that particular object or person and nothing else. To that extent, my friends, more generally the people I love, stand out against the rest of the world, of my acquaintance, and make, to me at least, a difference that counts. They are, to that extent, individuals. They're not like everyone else. And so am I, because, as I said earlier, when I see my friends in their actions, which depends on our history together, I see something no one else sees. If another friend had been in the schoolyard with me that day, our reactions would have overlapped. But to the extent that our histories are different, we would not have had the same reaction to Tom's behavior. According again to C.S. Lewis, Charles Lamb said somewhere that if one of three friends, A, B, and C, should die, B loses not only A, but also A's part in C, while C loses not only A, but also A's part in B. In each of my friends, there is something that only another friend can truly bring out. Our lives and the lives of our friends interpenetrate, the more so, the closer we are, and our lives develop in ways that made possible only by relationships with one another. If I and someone else are both your friends and love you, as we say, for yourself, the self each one of us loves is bound to be a little different, because we'll see different things in you. That I love you for yourself because of who you are is only a partial truth. I also love you because of who I am. The full truth, in other words, is in Montaigne's famous non-explanation of his friendship with La Boétie, when he said, "If you ask me why I love you, I can only say, because it was you, and also because it was I." Thank you very much.
Wonderful. We have about 20 minutes for questions. There are microphones in the aisles. If you'd like to ask a question, approach a microphone and please speak into it. Also, please keep your questions brief.
I can do it. You know. Yes.
If I have a dear friend,
Sorry?
If I have a dear friend,
Yeah.
and my friend has a vendetta in which I have no part, he has some family conflict, and my friend dies, and on his deathbed he says, "I want you to carry on my vendetta." What do I owe a dead friend? What do I owe a dead friend?
Well, I think. Sorry. I think you'll have to describe the situation in more detailed terms. For example, if you think that the vendetta in which he is involved has some reason, right, I think you may in fact continue it. If you think it doesn't have a reason, then I think you will think less of him and therefore think yourself less obliged to do so. It all depends. I think that you can't give, again, a general answer to a question of that sort. You have to specify the situation, and then we can decide in a particular case. I mean, one of the things that I'm trying to say here is that we need to be very particularist about how to adjudicate various situations. We can't give general criteria, because the general criteria are going to be either general or informative. They can't be both. So your question is a very good one, provided that we have a concrete story to be able to discuss. In general, I don't know what obligation you owe to the dead, because there is no single set of obligations that we owe to the dead. It depends, for example, if the dead are good people or not, right? Whether I like them or not, whether I feel obliged to them or not. And all those things go into making the concrete situation to which I'm called to react. I'm sorry that I'm putting my hands like that, but the lights are really directly into me. I can't see anything otherwise. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's the best I can do, I think.
If I could just follow.
Sure.
It comes to mind because we see so many situations in the world, and this tends to be more of a political or a warlike thing, where he has killed my friend, and therefore I must,
right,
by my obligation of my friendship, I must carry on this fight, right, and I must carry it on through generations.
That's right.
And I must maintain a vendetta that becomes a war that goes on far beyond the original participants.
You're right.
Because of some bound of friendship.
Well, it's not only friendship that's involved in that. It's also a very deep reliance on the notion of honor, right? That adds something. Just because somebody killed my friend, I will probably I may have the desire to kill them, but I won't act on it, I think. But if I live within a context where somebody's killing my friend is a blot on my honor, I will certainly go ahead and do it. But that's not only because of friendship, it's because honor is such an ambivalent, sort of double-edged value, or virtue, if you want to call it that. My other colleague, Anthony Appiah, is now just finishing a book on honor and how it doesn't function very much in the world today. Sometimes I think that's a good thing, sometimes I think it's a bad thing, but then that's what I think about everything. Yes?
Well, there are pieces of both art and literature which well, their subject is the relationship between a human and an animal.
Right.
Have you had thoughts about those friendships, especially the distinctions or similarities between the friendships that you've spoken of tonight?
No, I think the situation is not very different. I mean, it's generally speaking simpler, because animals in that respect are simpler than human beings, but a particular person relationship with a particular animal can be incredibly complex. It may seem ridiculous to a third party, because the third party just sees a dog, whereas I see a particular dog that's very different from that other dog over there, which is hateful to me, and so on. And I think it repeats, it has the same structure, though as I say, it is a little simpler. But there are people, especially people who depend on their animals, who have very, very deep relationships with them. And nothing I say, I hope nothing I say, is inconsistent with that. But again, it involves seeing the dog as an individual, rather than as, generically speaking, an animal. You see, that I think is crucial. Does that answer your question? Yes. Good, thank you. Yes, sir.
Hi, yeah, I really enjoyed your talk. It
Thank
was
you.
very interesting. And I'm going to start talking and hope that it turns out that my intentions are actually clear in what I want to say to you.
We'll see. You don't know that yet, right?
I don't know yet, no. And I have a feeling though, but I don't know it yet. I guess two things that are kind of related bother me about what you say. One is, it seems like you would say that it's never right to say of oneself or somebody else that he wasn't himself, or I'm not myself today. Because in everything that we do, that's who we are. We manifest ourselves only in our actions, and there's nothing behind that, right? So it's not correct to say I wasn't myself, because myself is how I was or acted. And secondly, you don't seem to leave much of a place for, I don't know, muddle, confusion in one's self. Shouldn't use that word. In one's inner life, right? So often I have the experience, I don't think I'm unique, in kind of surprising myself in what I end up doing, right? Because I don't have a clear idea, clear focus, and boom, I've done it. Oh. And yet, so I'm kind of accountable for that too, just as much as, you know, I don't know, I deliberated and thought about it and figured out how I should act to this person and then carried it out. So, yeah. I'm done. I hope I said something clear enough for you to respond to.
Very, very clear. But very wrong. No, just joking. The first question, that the way I speak doesn't allow someone to say, I'm not myself today. No, I think that it does, because I'm not trying to make a really regimented use of this language. To say that I'm not myself today is, you know, a loose way of speaking, saying that what I'm doing, today I feel that I don't have perfect control over my actions or my thoughts or something like that, and that's something that happens to us all the time. To say that I'm not being myself today is not, however, to say I'm a different person, right? It's just to say that I don't feel that I have complete control of my faculties or my abilities or whatever. That, I think, is just a loose way of talking. The second point that you made, I think, is a very important one. The trouble is that you have to remind me what it is.
Your answer was perfect.
Now, come on.
You've forgotten what I said. What did I say? Oh, that you didn't allow enough room for muddle and confusion,
no.
and God knows what goes on, right?
That was your answer. I see. I see. That is a good answer, yeah. I don't think so. I think I do allow for muddles, but I think a muddle is different from part of what you described, where you said that you're not quite sure what you are doing, and all of a sudden you do something, right? I don't see that you should not be held responsible for that. The fact that, you know, you didn't plan it deliberately in that case, I mean, we're not in a legal courtroom here, right? We're not talking about, you know, whether you should be executed or not. I'm saying, is that action that you found yourself performing as much a part of you as an action that you deliberated about? Well, and I want to say, yeah, I don't see why not. Why would you say that it isn't?
Well, as you're talking, you know, all I could do is think of conversations with my wife where I always have an explanation for, you know, whatever it is I've done that that excuses me, right? You know, and of course it's, you know, obviously not right. It's just a rationalization.
Oh, yeah?
Is it? No, because I guess I want to agree with you and say, yeah, I recognize that that was me, you know, and that's what I don't like, that oh my God, you're right. And I try to deny that by papering it over with rationality.
Well, not rationality, but rationalization.
That's what I wanted to say,
Yeah.
yeah, rationalization, yeah.
Yeah, I don't see, I mean, the fact that we often try to give an explanation that will satisfy someone else about what we did, and try, by giving that kind of explanation, in fact, to change what it is that we did, because that's what the explanation does, right? It says, well, no, I didn't do exactly what you thought. I didn't really, you know, run off with someone else last night. I just slipped, or something like that. You're changing it. And what you're doing, it could be right. You could be right in what you're saying, but you could also not be right, in which case you're just evading responsibility, right? I don't see how that connects with muddles or with responsibility, however. I'm sorry about that. I don't quite see it.
Yeah, I'm not prepared to,
you know,
make a clear distinction at the moment either. All right, well, thank you very much.
Not at all. Pleasure.
I'll bow out here.
Always good to talk to
Let
somebody
this
who knows
gentleman
what they're
take
talking
over.
about.
Excuse
Yeah.
me? Always good to, I didn't hear that one.
Sorry?
Always good to talk to what kind of a person?
With a person who always knows what they're talking about.
Ah, yes. Okay.
Please.
Thank you for being here. I was wondering, on the question of people beyond the age of 40 tending to be more settled and being less open to friendships, or at least less open to a variety of friendships. I'm wondering, do you see, you know, like within the last 10 years, the explosion of online social networking,
yes.
I'm wondering, you know, do you think that, say, Facebook will always be teenager and 20-something type of network, and by the time people will reach the age of 40, like they'll start to not care about things like Facebook as much?
No, I don't think so. I think that people who start with Facebook will probably stay with it for the rest of their lives. I mean, individuals may change their view about it and get bored or whatever, but I don't see why not. I mean, people over 40 now are not doing very much about Facebook because they weren't used to it early enough. But it seems to me that the problems that I was pointing to before about friendship don't apply so much to Facebook friends. I said that earlier this afternoon. I hate using friend as a verb. So that's already a travesty on the relationship. Yeah. But what the sort of the aspects of yourself that friending somebody involves, right, are very different from the aspects of yourself that engaging with somebody directly involves. And in some way, though not necessarily, in some way, I think they are not as complicated relationships as the relationships that, you know, you have somebody whom you see a lot, whom you spend a lot of time talking and engaging in much more complicated communication than you do with, you know, a line or two every now and then. So those friendships, I think, will not be any more difficult to have, whatever age you're at, if you're used to using Facebook. It's the personal, if you want to call them that, rather than the virtual friendships that become more difficult. And I think that's actually true. It first struck me when a friend and colleague of mine, when I was teaching at the University of Pittsburgh, left to go to another place and to teach someone else, and then came back to give an examination, a PhD examination. We were talking, stayed with me, and he was telling me that he was very lonely in this new place. And I said, lonely? I said, you're the most social person I know. And he said, you know, it's much more difficult, you know, to do it now, to get involved with people now. And, you know, first I thought, well, yeah, he's busy, this, that, and the other. But in the end, I think it has to do with, you know, whether you feel settled or not. And in a serious way, I think it's a good thing not to feel settled. And to make new friends later on. And I think that's one of the great things that retirement allows some people to do, for example. When you change context and all of a sudden you find yourself at an earlier mental age than you were when you finished your 20, 30, 40 years of work or whatever. And people become more flexible again. So ideally, as far as I'm concerned, it's a lifelong process, this self-construction that I was talking about. It should never end. But it is more and more difficult to do as you go as you go along. I mean, people expect things from you. You think they expect things from you. You think you should be the serious professor, and not do silly things. And there it is, And one day you realize that that's what you've become, as Frankie the Fib says, Thank you.
Thank you.
Are you leaving, or are you going to ask a question?
Hi.
Okay.
I have a question about, I guess, neediness and friendship. It seems like a lot of friends are built around a pact that we will exist, but we won't require major things from one another. So, for instance, if Tom were all of a sudden to need quite a lot of money from you, or were all of a sudden physically injured in a way that would create this greater need between friends, is it always, what does that do to
No, I think it's a very good point. I see friendships sort of on a continuum, from very casual ones to very, very complex, lifelong ones. And if Tom needs something, in all probability, I'll do everything in my power to provide it for him. If my other friend, whom I see every now and then, and on whom I know I can depend for some things, but not on others, if they need the same kind of thing that Tom needed, I won't be able to give it to them. And I don't see that I, so to speak, should, right? Because the weaker the relationship is, the less stringent the obligations are that you have, or the commitment that you have to one another. If you see it on a continuum basis, you don't need to think that the relationship is a different one, but only a different in kind, in other words, but only a difference in degree. I use sometimes an analogy here that may sound too professorial, but I like to think of relationships that we have with people on the model of relationships that we have to books. So, here are 3 books: Moby Dick, The Old Man and the Sea, and Jaws. They're about the same thing. Man pursues a fish. Jaws, I spent a whole night trying to finish it so I could find out what happens to the shark and all that. But as soon as I finished it, I threw it away. That was it. The Old Man and the Sea, well, I was taught it in high school, and we thought about the symbolism of this and that and the other. Moby Dick, it took me forever to get into. Right? It was very difficult for me to get into, but once I did, it's something that has stayed with me and that I return to. I use it, I check passages in it, and so on and so forth. It's the same thing with friends. Right? There are people whom I have a casual relationship with that may not last very long, or that it may last but impinge on very few aspects of my life. And there are people who accompany me through life. And their needs are very important to me. Ideally, though I think we all find it very difficult to do that, they should be as important to me as my own. Right? So I can, if my friend Tom needs a lot of money, I'll do my best to give it to him, or to borrow it for him, or something like that. But if, you came to me, even if I knew you a bit, and said, I need $3 million, I'd say, yeah, go find a friend who will give it to you. So it's a matter of degree.
Do you think, can I just ask a follow-up?
As far as I'm concerned, of course.
Do you think that there are very few people who are capable of true friendship?
No, I don't. And that's one of the differences between Aristotle's view of friendship. Aristotle thinks there are very few people who are virtuous, and therefore very few people who can be friends. I think that goes against every indication that ordinary experience gives us. I think lots of people have very good friends. People who are not very good people have very good friends. And sometimes even people who are awful people have very good friends. And in fact, there are very few people who have no friends. If for no other reason, for prudential reasons, like if you have friends, you live longer, you have fewer colds. There are all kinds of things that they've discovered. And it makes perfect sense. If you have friends, when you get sick, they come to see you at the hospital and they take care of you when the hospital, is not capable of giving you the care that you need. So there are all kinds of, as I said, practical benefits to it. But no, I think friendship is very common. And because it is common, you can't give it a moral justification, you see. You could give it a moral justification if you thought that only the moral people can have it. And I see it much more often, and I can't justify it morally. That's why I'm trying to give it a justification or define its good in the influence it has in allowing us to form ourselves in an interesting and exciting way. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, there you go.
Thank Professor Neamas for visiting us in Missoula. I'd also like to thank President Dennison again and Henry Bugby's family for all their support. There will be a book signing in the lobby. Good evening.